explosions, and housing pressures became intense. And the idea was that landlords could exploit this situation by crowding people into single rooms and sometimes even half a room. It was called milking the poor. And Andrew Mearns, who wrote The Bitter Cry Out Across London, described it, housing conditions in London, as like slaves in a galley ship. Come in. Yeah. And middlemen who collected the rents claimed that they got more money from funerals. Conditions were so bad that people died very readily. They got more money from funerals than they got from rents. There were huge health impacts. And so obviously employers started to get worried and solutions began to emerge, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I just wanted to briefly say how I got pulled into housing, because it wasn't my basic subject. I was more into social conditions. So the first side of my baptism was living in Chicago in the ghetto, where we said that we wouldn't live in a flat where there were rats inside the flat. And it was really difficult to find a flat where there weren't rats inside the flat. So that was part of the whole Martin Luther King Civil Rights End Slums campaign. And I considered that that west side of Chicago was worse than Tanzania, which was the poorest country in Africa at the time. Then moved to Holloway in inner London, choosing the worst area that we could find on the grounds that it was important to stop America coming to Britain. And lo and behold, the council decided to demolish the area, and it asked landlords to evict all their insecure tenants. So out of the area with 1,000 units in it, 500 families were made homeless by the council's action, which obviously created panic in the area and a big protest among the tenants, which actually did end up changing the law for furnished tenants, which was quite successful. But meanwhile, those families were stuck. And that taught me, both the Chicago experience and the Islington Holloway experience, taught me that housing and communities were completely intertwined and that you couldn't separate them. That was a very big lesson. And I also concluded that if council landlords couldn't be trusted and private landlords couldn't be trusted, then why shouldn't tenants actually take control of their own housing? So that was how I came to be involved in forming tenant cooperatives, by which groups of tenants secured agreements with either a benign council or a benign housing association to take over control of a small area of property on a local basis and manage it. And as a kind of ancillary to that activity, those tenants' organisations invariably organised play groups, summer play schemes, food cooperatives, law centres, advice centres. There were big spin-offs from tenants actually getting organised. And the three areas of the country that really pioneered that kind of work were Islington, where I lived and lived, Liverpool and Glasgow. Those were the big growth areas. And the lesson was that housing can create community well-being if it's run locally on the ground. And that's what inspired this book. So coming on to the book, what's it about? Well, the core argument is that housing involves community inspired by these experiences. And I wanted to show what works. And there's a lot of evidence of what works, as well as evidence of what doesn't work. And history, the history of housing, shows how major the impact of housing is on community. And it also shows that when there are benign landlord responses, housing responses, that transforms the conditions of an area. And that led to the growth of government's role in housing, alongside the continuation of non-profit housing. So I've got a few examples what works, which are detailed in the book. So almshouses were among the very earliest housing associations, formed usually by churches or local anti-poverty charities, building small cottagey sort of houses around courtyards. You've probably seen almshouses around London. There are about 3,000 almshouses still in existence. And recently a survey was done of the life experience of these people who live in almshouses, who are always poor and vulnerable and often disabled. And it found that they had a life expectancy 2 years longer than the average population because they're cared for. And I think that's a very interesting illustration of what happens when you treat tenants properly. So the second example is Robert Owen, who was a very successful young industrialist who was sent by the government, was recruited by the government to rescue a very, very expensive to run workhouse in New Lanark in Scotland that was, well, it was a horrible place, basically, let's put it simply. And he introduced both workplace reforms, so he abolished capital punishment. He abolished all physical, not capital punishment, physical punishment. He limited the hours that women could work, I think, to 10 hours a day, which was big progress. And he abolished child labour, which meant children under the age of 10. So it was huge progress, but it was very modest in the eyes of what we would consider today. But he also felt that if you had to work in a workhouse, you needed decent housing, you needed childcare, you needed elderly care, you needed schools and daycare centres to look after the children. And so he gradually built up in New Lanark not only a very progressive way of actually running the factory, so it became profit-making very quickly. And the main way he did that was by praising people for their work rather than beating them for their not work, but also by providing all these ancillary services. And so he was considered both the founder of cooperatives, which he actually wasn't, but he was very cooperative. And he wrote this report to the government called a report to the County of Lanark on how to improve people's conditions. And from that, we got our labour laws and our control of workers' conditions. So he was a very, very pioneering housing person, although he was mainly an employment and work person. And then he's followed by Octavia Hill, who's a young woman who was absolutely horrified by the conditions that she saw among the poor families of the children that she helped to look after in a ragged school. And she visited them at home and saw just how absolutely appalling conditions were. She persuaded people like John Ruskin to buy properties that were in these atrocious conditions so that she could run them. And she agreed with them that they would keep the ownership of the property and she would give any margin from the rents that she made, but that her core purpose would be to actually keep the properties clean and in a minimal state of repair and try and move people around within the properties so they got a little bit more space for no higher rents. And she found that she could actually make slums work and pay their way as long as she ran the properties very, very carefully. So she gradually, over time, recruited women housing managers. She argued that women had to do this job because it involved calling on the tenants every week to collect the rents. That was the other thing she argued, that only by face-to-face contact and by actually collecting rents directly and personally would you keep arrears down, and also would you know what the repairs issues were and what other social problems tenants were facing so that you could actually deal with them. And she, like Robert Owen, although from the other end, set up ancillary activities, like she ran boys' clubs to keep them out of trouble. She ran women's groups so that women wouldn't be isolated and depressed, and hopefully learn skills. So, and she actually, when she died, she was responsible for 15,000 properties. And I think she had 50 housing managers in her books. And each manager was responsible for 300 properties. and did everything in relation to those properties, collected the rents, repaired them, took up any of the issues that the tenants raised, kept the communal areas clean, and tried to disperse the tenants into rooms, because most of them lived in one room only, where they would have a little bit more space. So she was a very, very pioneering woman, followed by the Society of Women Housing Managers. That was her sort of follow-on body. The other initiative that happened in the 19th century was what was called 5% philanthropies, whereby industrialists decided to invest in building homes, flats, from which they would only get 5% profit, which I think is quite funny, really. But it was considered philanthropy, and that's how Peabody Trust, for example, came into existence, by building blocks under the 5% philanthropy rule. And then the other very, very interesting initiative was the model villages, such as the New Erswick Roundtree built, Bourneville that Cadbury built, Wedgwood that Joshua Wedgwood built, Port Sunlight that Lever built, and so on. There were lots of these model villages which actually ended up inspiring. They were only sort of one-off examples, but they were places where the employers felt that they had to take care of their workers' housing needs and social needs and community needs if they were going to flourish. So all of those examples basically gave us the basis for social housing, but it all got messed up by the wars. So pre-war, we had lots and lots of bylaw housing, which is the typical terraces, two up, two down terraces. 5 million of those were built. But when World War I broke out, the government adopted this slogan, homes fit for heroes. We've got to do better than that. We've got to go to the suburbs. There's this famous wartime poster which shows the bylaw housing here and out there, semi-detached suburbs. But it did unleash the building of council housing. 1 million council homes were built in that pre-war, interwar period, along with slum clearance, which had the same problem of displacing the poorest people. Council housing was cheap and subsidized, but it wasn't cheap enough for the very poor, for the people in precarious work. Then came World War II, everything stopped again. And then following World War II, because of a huge shortage of housing and need for more housing, we embarked on what we called mass housing, and 6 million council homes were built in that post-war period up to the early 1970s, along with new towns and, again, slum clearance programs. Huge numbers, which completely changed the way that housing was run. And to the government's horror, suddenly there was too much council housing. There weren't enough people to get in to the flats. So even in Islington, the Elthorne estate was built in the 1970s. There were 19 out of 20 refusals for people who needed a home. They just wouldn't move there. So I think that was a very big shock to the government. I mean, it was much higher in other parts of the country. For example, in Glasgow, there was an estate that was only ever 3/4 built. And when they got 3/4 of the way to completion, they realized there was nobody to live in it. So they just pulled it down again before it ever got completed. I mean, that's an extreme example. But estate demolition took off, which was a horrifying shock, both for tenants and communities, and for councils, and for the government. And the government therefore took this initiative. It set up something called the Priority Estates Project, which actually I worked for 10 years, on the basis that you had to listen to tenants and you had to manage estates on the ground. And it actually proved incredibly successful. It proved that you had the team on the ground. If you created an estate budget and if you listened to tenants, you could actually make even the most difficult estates work. Meanwhile, Thatcher introduced extremely radical reforms. So the right to buy was one, whereby 2 million council homes were eventually bought by tenants. Large-scale voluntary transfer, whereby another 2 million were actually transferred from councils to housing associations. The rent controls that had been in place from 1915, I haven't had time to explain rent controls, were released and the private rented sector actually boomed. And then just general privatisation of services, which mainly meant that everything was competitive tendering. So park keeping became patrols through competitive tendering, even housing management, which never worked. And through all of those pressures, there was a constant rumbling of disorder. So there was the Brixton riots in 1981, there were the Toxteth riots also in 1981. In 1985, there was the Broadwater Farm riots. And as a result of that, Thatcher actually, although on the one hand, she was this radically privatising, she also believed in and allowed strong government intervention to compensate for the pressures of disorder. But meanwhile, the poorest areas actually attracted the most marginal tenants, which very often was tenants from ethnic minorities. And so those areas became racially much more segregated. They weren't segregated, but they were certainly had higher concentrations of minorities, often the old slums or the West Estates. And so stigma attached to those poorest areas and ethnic minorities were often blamed for the conditions, which became a vicious circle. So when New Labour got elected into this really bad situation, New Labour went hell for leather on renewing the poorest neighbourhoods. It set up the social exclusion unit, which had 19 policy action teams to tackle things like lone parenthood, truancy, vandalism, neighbourhood neglect, housing management, and so on. And it pioneered an approach that it called New Deal for Communities, whereby it would sort of ring fence an area of up to 5,000 units, and that area would have a fund, and there would be a nominated lead person to set up local solutions within that area to tackle those problems. There were 39 of those areas set within a whole national strategy for neighbourhood renewal, which included the 88 most deprived local authorities. And under that, Labour declared zone upon zone. So there were prime zones and there were work zones and skill zones and every kind of zone you could think of. So some areas had up to 5 or 6 different initiatives going on at the same time. So, and that did have, pardon? I know, so, and that did have a radical impact on conditions, measurable impact. But at the same time, New Labour was very ambitious and it set up something called an urban task force, which lasted for a year to try and tackle the bigger problems of declining ex-industrial cities, which included the whole of East London, by the way, because that was a declining part of a city. And it also then followed that with the Sustainable Development Commission, which lasted for 10 years as the government's critical friend on the environment. These were huge issues. I was actually a member of both, and I had the privilege of being, basically, we were given access to all government statistics. So when we talk about the government being slow on climate change, it is utterly disgraceful because we were made privy to the information that the government had on the potential future impacts of climate change and did very little about it. We tried our best. Meanwhile, the actual impact of a change of government when New Labour lost power was absolutely huge. So there was like this radical shift from being a welfare system to being an individualistic, help people get on their own feet kind of system. And the way the government actually implemented that under the coalition was, first of all, to say that it wouldn't attack elderly pension situations. it wouldn't reduce funding for schools, and it wouldn't damage the NHS. So it had those kind of three commitments. And whatever it did to kind of change this shift away from welfare would be done in a way that wouldn't affect the poorest people. In practice, that really, really didn't happen. So first of all, there was a massive loss of funding. Secondly, there was pressure for housing associations to grow bigger and bigger because they lost their government funding, and so they had to borrow from the private banks. And to do that, they had to be bigger. So it meant that many small associations, which were often very grassroots and very focused on what people needed, actually weren't viable anymore. And so they got gobbled up by bigger associations. A lot of local services were lost, for example, youth services or day centres for elderly people. And many people think that the 2011 riots were a direct result of the loss of youth provision right across the board, for example, in Haringey, where the riots began. And at the same time, the scale of housing associations grew and their level of disrepair also grew. And therefore, the stigma of social housing also grew. And meanwhile, because the right to buy was shrinking the stock, and because demolitions were also shrinking the stock because of bad conditions, homelessness grew. And also, as the private sector was freed up, so its rents increased astronomically, and insecurity was built in now, so people could be evicted very easily. So all those factors led to greater level of homelessness. People can't hear me.
Just because of the noise outside, maybe just a bit louder.
Can people hear me? Okay, I'll talk a bit louder. Jess says I should talk a bit louder. I always have to do what Jess says. Okay, so how did austerity actually play out? Well, Case, in its report on that experience, had the very clever title of Social Policy in a Cold Climate, which just about sums it up. There was a 40% cut to local authorities, and non-statutory services were cut, as I've mentioned already. There were the riots in 2011, 41% cut to Sure Start and many closures, as well as elderly daycare centres. Schools were protected, but there was an 80% cut in social housing funds, plus the bedroom tax if you were under occupying a bedroom, which only applied to social renting. It didn't apply to private renting, and it didn't apply to owner occupation. And then there was a rent cap, so you could only get benefit for rents up to a certain point. And I think, I can't remember what the actual figure was it 3/4 of all rents across the country were over the rent cap? So it meant that there was a huge increase in poverty, a big increase in arrears, and lots of insecurity. And the housing benefit became the single biggest housing cost. Becky did a very good chapter in the book on social policy in a cold climate about all of this. Thank you, Becky. It was very useful. Yeah. Meanwhile, over 50% of tenants received housing benefit, many of them in work, and that was 4.8 million people, households. So it's a huge issue, this housing benefit issue, and the government was very exercised about it. And in an attempt to cut the housing benefit bill and stop housing associations from pushing up their rents, the government introduced a rent cut over 4 years for housing associations, which completely threw out their business plans, completely incapacitated them to pay their loans that they borrowed in order to build. And so basically, housing finance became a complete mess. And meanwhile, the whole emphasis under austerity was on social self-reliance versus welfare support. The whole welfare state idea of a secure safety net that you could rely on was shredded. And David Cameron came up with a very clever idea as an alternative. He thought that having a big society would be very good. In other words, people could help each other rather than let the state help them. Well, it didn't work very well. On the one hand, in spite of rising university fees and all the pressures on young people's incomes, more people went to university than previously, which is interesting, and more young people got work, which is also interesting. And one of the theories is that all the sort of welfare pressures that the government had created under austerity did actually push more young people into both further education and into jobs. So that was a kind of interesting outcome, but we don't know that that's what did actually happen, but that's one theory. Meanwhile, social policy itself shifted in very big ways. So schools, health and pensions were protected, benefits were cut, local authorities were cut, and welfare became much narrower, less universal, more private, with social landlords forced to try and close the gaps in provision. The big society in general failed. It was too top down, and there was very little NGO involved. I'm nearly there. So what alternatives emerged for council housing in all of this turmoil? Well, first of all, housing associations grew massively and became much bigger than local authorities. Tenant management organisations multiplied, and there were many transfers of stock and there were many mergers. At the same time, private renting exploded, I think is the best way to call it. So the abolition of controls and a free-for-all in terms of security of tenure and rents made it possible for many, many landlords to actually move into private renting. What's interesting is that some housing associations who could no longer build much social housing and were losing stock decided to branch into producing private renting, which was actually very useful because one, they could make it affordable, and two, they could make it secure. You didn't have to evict tenants. And three, they could maintain it at a decent standard. So people who couldn't get into social housing and couldn't afford to become owner-occupiers did actually, if they were lucky enough, have this option of a more benign form of private renting than the pure private market version. And meanwhile, owner occupation continued, although it did eventually start to dip a bit through the financial crisis, and shared ownership became a bigger and bigger issue, which was a way of buying part of your property with a view to eventually becoming, rather than just paying rent forever, you eventually became the owner of your property. And the big change was recognition that local housing management made a difference. So how did this affect the worst estates? I mean, by now, 1/3 of council housing was classed, or ex-council housing, the transfer estates as well, was considered difficult to let. And the Grenfell fire disaster highlighted all the problems that had accumulated of lack of tenants' voice, lack of local on-the-ground management, lack of maintenance, lack of care over security in multi-story blocks and so on. And that led to a big shift from new build to renovation. It also persuaded me, not that I needed any persuasion, that demolition was not the answer, because if you demolished, you lost a lot of social housing and you disrupted the whole community and dispersed people. And in its place, you put what was called a mixed community, which was de facto a private area of high cost housing and a smattering of social renting. So it wasn't really a mixed community. So there was a big sort of debate about how you could actually reverse poor conditions. And there seemed to be two factors that really mattered. One was retrofitting the property so the property became decent, and the other was managing it locally. And we give in the book, based on work that Ellie and I have done, some very, very good examples of where you can actually rescue the most difficult estates. And I suppose the big lesson from all of this was that neighbourhoods need management. They can't be run unless they're run hands-on and on the ground, and they can't work unless they have multiple services. So you do need community facilities and support, just like Robert Owen showed, if you want to make low-income areas of rented housing work. So where next? My last slide. Well, social is key to social housing. You can't just have bricks and mortar, it just won't work. And there are so many examples of social landlords tackling social issues and the positive impact of that.